Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing some trade news involving the San Jose Sharks. There have been a lot of trade rumors surrounding the Sharks thus far this season. In particular, it has been Timo Meier and to a slightly lesser extent Erik Karlsson, but neither of those two players are the first domino to fall here for the Sharks in what is likely to be a pretty busy last few months of this season. Instead, it is Matt Nieto being traded to the Colorado Avalanche along with Ryan Merkley in exchange for defenseman Jacob MacDonald and forward Martin Kaut. Now, before we get into the two Sharks players moved, let's first talk a bit about the two players acquired from Colorado. The first being Jacob MacDonald, a defenseman, not a prospect, so don't sort of get your hopes up that the Sharks are going to be bolstering their relatively weak defensive prospect pool. Instead, he is a player who has played about 33 games with the Avalanche thus far this season and has been pretty decent with them. The fact is that the Sharks are relatively thin even at the NHL level in terms of defensemen, especially with Shemek likely being out long term. At times, these past couple of games, they've had to go with a third defensive pairing of Cicek and Harrington. And while both of those players have at times been good this season, on average they've been kind of bad. So adding Jacob MacDonald will help bolster this defensive unit for the San Jose Sharks. Does that really matter in the long run? Not particularly, but I guess it'll allow the Sharks to have a better top six. The other player acquired, and I guess the more interesting player in this deal, was Martin Kaut. Now, he's in an extremely similar position of Ryan Merkley. He is a struggling prospect who has never really managed to find a footing with the main squad that he is on, the Colorado Avalanche. Coincidentally, Kaut was actually only picked 5 spots ahead of Ryan Merkley in the 2018 NHL entry draft. And so Kaut has played about 27 games this season with the Avalanche, has only put up 3 points, but in the AHL he has been doing some pretty decent work. So it is indeed very similar to Ryan Merkley. He just can't seem to cross that threshold to get some constant time. Now, of course, the fact is that the competition to be able to make it onto the Avalanche is likely a bit more aggressive than the competition to be able to play with the San Jose Sharks. So it is quite possible that Kaut could factor in some way onto the Sharks roster at some point this season or next. But unless this change of scenery ends up being a very big deal for Kaut, I'm not entirely sure if this ends up being an actual positive addition for the San Jose Sharks. The other thing to mention here, and what kind of makes this trade look quite ugly here, is that Kaut was on waivers earlier this season, meaning that Mike Grier had the opportunity to pick up Martin Kaut for free a few weeks ago and yet decided not to do so, and now is forced to make a trade away a couple of assets to pick him up anyway. So unless Jacob MacDonald was really the centerpiece of this trade by Mike Grier for some reason, it definitely is quite awkward. Other reasons to not like this trade involve the two players moved by the Sharks, the first one being Matt Nieto. The fact is that the Sharks were not going to make the playoffs this season. It's just not going to happen, meaning the Sharks are likely to be making multiple trades to get rid of some expiring contracts, and Matt Nieto was one of them. And Nieto, while not the most exciting asset, is still the type of player that many teams would like to pick up at the deadline to help bolster their depth. And he was, with how he has played this season, being, part of one of the league's best penalty kills and even actually having some offensive output, I thought Nieto could request maybe a 4th round pick, potentially even a 3rd round pick. But instead, the Sharks get a no round pick. There are no draft picks involved in this trade, and instead end up in a sort of player for player swap where Matt Nieto is being traded for the, I think, worse off Jacob MacDonald. I personally believe that Nieto is the best player involved in this 4-person deal, and so it just feels like a bit of a misuse of assets here from Mike Grier. But the other reason why I'm not a huge fan of this trade is the Ryan Merkley situation. Now, for those who have been a Sharks fan for a while, you know that Merkley's hype has kind of gone from here all the way down to here over these last few years. Drafted in that 2018 entry draft, the obvious rumors circled of his attitude attitude issues, but it was said that he had the potential to be a very good offensive defenseman in the NHL at some point if he could pan out. And it was last season where he actually really had his sort of breakout year. You could say that he played almost half the season with the San Jose Sharks, and personally, I thought Merkley actually played decent in his relatively sheltered third pairing minutes last season, but it was somewhat clear that at the very least by management standards, he took a step back this season, never even managed to play a single game for the San Jose Sharks in the regular season this year, has played instead with the San Jose Barracuda, was a healthy scratch at times, and eventually requested a trade, and this is the result of that requested trade from a few weeks ago. But the fact is that I look at Ryan Merkley and I look at Martin Kaut, which is the sort of struggling prospect swap here, and I feel as though that Merkley probably has a higher ceiling, right? It's very possible that neither of these prospects ever actually pan out. But while I look at Kaut and I say at best, he can be like a second liner, but realistically a bottom six forward. And then I look at best of Ryan Merkley, he could be a top pairing defenseman in the NHL. I find as though that the Sharks have gone for essentially like a low risk, low reward type of play, which is never really something that you want to do in a prospect swap. You want to swap two players who have relatively similar ceilings, and I don't necessarily think that is the case here. This is not to say that Merkley is indeed going to pan into that top pairing defenseman, but you never know, and I don't think that Martin Kaut is going to do that either. So it's really just a player for player swap where I think the Sharks lost out on, a prospect for prospect swap that I think the Sharks lost out on. Martin Kaut could have been picked up off of waivers just a few weeks ago, and the Sharks don't end up with any sort of draft pick from this deal. I feel as though from pretty much every single side of this trade that you look at, this is an absolute failing from Mike Grier. And so his first trade of this season, where we're looking to be unloading multiple of these expiring contracts, I feel as though Mike Grier has not started off particularly well. Class dismissed.